Hello students, welcome back to another video. We are still continuing our marathon. We are looking at the Caribbean history syllabus, the newly revised Caribbean history syllabus today. And guys, please remember to like, share, and leave a comment on this video and to watch the ads also. So you have been studying from your past paper question. It's time to put that aside and let us go to the real deal, which is the syllabus. This is where the examiners set the questions from. All right, so we're going to begin. Section A, Theme 1, the indigenous peoples and the Europeans. Students should be able to describe the migratory and settlement patterns of the indigenous peoples in the Caribbean up to the arrival of the Spanish in 1492. Now, before the arrival of the Spanish in 1492, the Caribbean was inhabited by several indigenous people or groups who migrated from the mainland of South America and settled across the islands over thousands of years ago. Now, do you know what were or who were the main groups, indigenous groups in the Caribbean before the arrival of the Spanish? Do you know that answer? Very good. If your answer is we had the Siboney group, the Sibonite, we had the Arawaks, also called the Tainos, and we also had the Caribs, which are also called the Kalinago. Now, let us look at the origins of the indigenous people. So, most indigenous groups in the Caribbean are believed to have originated from northeastern South America. These groups migrated over time along canoe, along riverways and coastlines into the Caribbean Sea. Now, the first migrants, the Saboni, were the earliest known settlers. They arrived in the Caribbean around 4000 2000 BCE. They used basic stone tools. They were hunters, gatherers, and fishermen. They settled mainly in western Cuba, parts of Hispaniola, and the Bahamas. They were later displaced by a more advanced group like the Taínos. Now, after them, we had the Arawak migration, the Taínos. So, Arawak speaking peoples, known as the Taínos, began migrating from South America around 500 BCE to 900 CE. They moved gradually northward through the Lesser Antilles into the Greater Antilles. Now, by 900 CE, they had settled intensely in Cuba, Hispaniola, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and the Bahamas. The Taínos developed advanced agricultural techniques, complex societies, and built large villages. Another indigenous group, we're going to look at the Carib migration, the Kalinago. Now, the Caribs were a later wave of migrants. They came from South America. Which part of the Caribbean did the Caribs migrated to? Was it the Greater Antilles or the Lesser Antilles? Very good. So if your answer is they migrated into the Lesser Antilles around 1000 CE, you are very correct. The Caribs or the Kalinago, they were known for being more warlike than the Tainos and they often raid their communities. Now by 1492, the Kalinagos had settled in Dominica, St. Vincent, Grenada, and southern Lesser Antilles. Now let's look at their settlement patterns. Now the indigenous people they settled near rivers, coasts, and fertile valleys. They built villages near water sources for fishing and trade. Their, the villages were often the villages often included a ceremonial plaza for religious rituals and the Bate ball game. Now, summary of migration timeline. So the Tainos, they originated in South America. They lived in the Greater Antilles. The Kalinago, they originated from South America also, but they lived in the Lesser Antilles. All right. So now we're going to look at describe so just to give you a quick summary of the migratory and settlement patterns of the indigenous peoples in the Caribbean up to the arrival of the Spanish in 1492. So we did establish that the first people in the Caribbean, they came from South America. They came migrating by canoe through the islands. The earliest settlers were the Siboney, Ciboney. They arrived in 4000 to 2000 BCE. Then we had the Tainos or the Arawaks who migrated later, settling in the Greater Antilles and the Bahamas. We had the Caribs, the Kalinago, who arrived around 1000 CE. They settled in the Lesser Antilles. So by 1492, the Caribbean had three major groups, each with distinct cultures and settlement patterns, focused near rivers and coasts for farming, fishing, and trade. Now the syllabus is asking us to describe the social, political, and economic practices of the indigenous peoples in the Americas up to 1492. So we're going to look at the Tainos, the Kalinagos, and the Mayan practices up to 1492. We're going to focus on their interaction among social groups. We're going to look at their political system and leadership roles. We're also going to look at their economic patterns, including their levels of self-sufficiency, acquisition of surplus. All right, guys, so now we're going to focus on the social grouping and interaction of the Tainos. So we're going to look at the Tainos first. We're going to look at their political systems and leadership roles. We're also going to look at their economic patterns. Now, the Taino society, they were well organized. They had clear social divisions. Social interactions were respectful and cooperative, reflecting their communal lifestyle. Now, their main social groups were the cacique, which was a chief or leader of the village or region. They had the nobles, the warriors, the advisors. They also had the priests or the shamans who led religious ceremonies and acted as healers. They had the commoners, the farmers, the fishers, and artisans who made up the majority of the population. Now, what were the interaction among the groups? Social interaction was based on respect, cooperation, and duty to the community. The chief led and made decisions, but often consulted with the nobles, the warriors, and the advisors. The priests were respected spiritual leaders and acted as intermediaries between the gods and the people. The commoners, farmers, fishers, and the artisans, they interacted daily with each other and supported the higher classes through labor and service. Now, social mobility was limited because even though social mobility was limited, the relationships were generally peaceful and structured by mutual obligation. Now, what was the political system and leadership roles in the Taínos community? Now, Taínos political organization was decentralized but structured around village leadership. Their political structure, each village was ruled by a chief. The cacique ruled, which is also the chief, ruled over several villages and were regional leaders. The leadership was often hereditary, passing through the maternal line. Now, what were the roles of the leaders in the Taínos community? Now, the cacique or the chief, he was the head of the community, responsible for making decisions, distributing land, organizing labor, and leading in war and ceremonies. Now, what were the roles of the nobles, the warriors, and the advisors? Their role was to support the cacique or the chief with administrative and military duties. What was the role of the priest? Their role was to advise on spiritual matters and conduct religious rituals. So leadership was respected but not oppressive. It was based on consensus and communal welfare. Now let's look at the economic patterns of the Tainos. We're going to look at their level of self-sufficiency, acquisition of surplus. Now the Taino society was very self-sufficient. They relied on subsistence agriculture, fishing, and hunting, with some trade between highlands. Now their main economic activities were, based on what you are learning, what were the main economic activities of the Taino? Very good. Farming, fishing and hunting, craft production, levels of self-sufficiency and surplus. Each village produced most of what it needed, including food, tools, and shelter. Surpluses were used to support the cacique and nobility, host religious and social festivals, engage in trade with other villages or highlands. So whatever were left over, it was used to support the cacique, host religious and social festivals, and to engage in trade with other villages. So this surplus enabled a redistributive economy where leaders could provide for their people in times of needs. So quick summary of the Tainos. Taino society featured cooperative interaction among well-defined social groups with leadership focused on communal welfare. Their political system was village-based, with the cacique as a central authority. Economically, they were highly self-sufficient, producing surpluses that supported trade, leadership, and social events. Their way of life was balanced, sustainable, and deeply tied to the land and community. All right, so now we're going to look at the Kalinago and their social interaction, political system, leaderships, and economic patterns. The Kalinago, formerly known as the Caribs, were a powerful indigenous group in the Lesser Antilles. By the time of European contact, their societies were more militaristic and mobile than the Tainos. Yet they were also well organized and cooperative. Now let's look at the social grouping of the Kalinagos. Now the Kalinago society was semi-egalitarian with some distinctions based on gender, skill, and achievement rather than strict um, hierarchical um, positions. So their key social roles in the Kalinago society was warriors. They were central to society, mostly men trained for warfare from a young age. They also had the elders and advisors. These were older men and women who provided wisdom and guidance. The women played vital roles in agriculture, household management, and raising children. The chief or leader, recognized leader, usually chosen based on bravery and leadership in battle. There was a strong sense of communal responsibility. And while most of the warriors were honored, all members contributed to the survival of the group. Now we're going to look at their political system and leadership roles. The Kalinago politics were based on leadership by merit, especially in war. So unlike the system of the Tainos where the Kalinaga leadership was earned, political structure, elected or chosen leaders who held power during time of war or conflict. Leadership was temporary and conditional. A chief could be replaced if he lost respect or military skill. Decisions were often made collectively, especially during peacetime. Leadership roles led war, expeditions, and defense of the community, distributed war spoils, sometimes gaining influence by generosity. In the Kalinago society, they were presided over rituals and communal decisions with input from elders. Economic patterns. The Kalinago economy was based on subsistent activities with some regional trade and the occasional acquisition of goods through raids. Their main economic activities were, and they were similar to the Taínos. Farming, they grew cassava, sweet potatoes, yams, fishing and hunting. They used the canoes, nets, and bows to catch fish, turtles. Crafting, they made pottery, raiding, sometimes raided neighboring groups, including the Tainos, for resources and captives. Their level of self-sufficiency and acquisition of surplus. The Kalinaga community were largely self-sufficient, producing enough food and tools to sustain themselves. Cassava bread was a staple and could be stored, giving them a reliable food source. Surplus goods, example food, cotton, tools, were traded with neighboring highlands, stockpiled in preparation for war or times. Raids and warfare also brought goods and captives who were sometimes assimilated into the society. So, quick summary, the Kalinago had a flexible social structure that emphasizes courage, skill, and cooperation. Their political system was based on earned leadership, particularly in warfare. Economically, they were highly self-sufficient. They sustained themselves by agriculture, fishing, and crafting, while gaining surplus through trade and occasional raids. Their mobility and military focus helped them maintain independence longer than many other indigenous groups in the Caribbean. Now we're going to look at the Maya social interaction, political system, and leadership roles, also their economic patterns. Now the Maya civilization flourished in modern day, example in Mexico, Belize, and Guatemala and Honduras. They had a complex and stratified society, and advanced political system, and they were highly productive when it comes on to their economy. Now, what was the social interaction among the Maya? The Mayas were organized into city-states or kingdoms, each with a hierarchical society. Social interaction was based on class, religion, and communal activities. Social classes, we have the nobility, ruling families, priests, and elite warriors. They interacted mainly through politics and religion. We had the priest, which held great power, interacted with all classes during rituals and festivals. Their social classes were consisted of the artisans and merchants. They engaged in trade and supplied goods to elites, interacted widely across classes. All classes were also consisted of the commoners, which were farmers and laborers. They formed the majority and interacted through communal farming and market activities. Their social classes also consisted of slaves, who often were captives or those in debt. So if you were a war captive or you owe a lot of money or you were in debt, you were considered to be a slave. They performed labor and had limited interaction beyond their roles. Their cultural and religious interactions, they had festivals, ceremonies, they had the ball game, which were major social events that brought all classes together. Their marketplace was a key area for economic and social exchange. Now we're going to look at their political system and leadership roles. Now the Maya had a theocratic monarchy, meaning that power was often justified by religious authority. Now their political system, each city-state was ruled by a halak, which was a chuman, also referred to as a chuman, the supreme ruler or king. His authority was heretical, typically passed through the main line. Now, the leadership role, the leadership role of the chuman was he was the head of government and religion, led wars, collected tribute, and performed ceremonies. The Battabs were the local governors who oversaw towns or districts under the main ruler's authority. The priests advised rulers, maintained calendars, and conducted religious rituals. War leaders were also called Nakom, led military campaigns, and defended city-states. City-states were often competed, and leaders engaged in warfare, alliances, and diplomacy. The economic patterns of the Maya, it's also similar to the Kalinago and the Taino. They had agricultural production. They used slash and burn, terracing, and raised field system. Their main crops were beans, squash, guaco, and cotton. They engaged in craft production and trade. They also produced pottery. Now, the level of sufficiency and acquisition of surplus. Most households were self-sufficient. They grow their own food and make basic goods. City-states collected tribute from conquered areas in the form of food, labor, and luxury items. Surpluses were stored and used to support the elite class, sustain large urban centers, or fund religious festivals. So, quick summary, the Maya had a complex class-based society where social interaction was shaped by religion, hierarchy, and shared culture. Their political system featured hereditary monarchs supported by a noble class and priests. Economically, they were largely self-sufficient like the other groups, with surplus production that supported urban centers and trade. Their civilization blended agriculture, trade, and religious duty into a dynamic and enduring society. So that is it, guys. On, let's go back. We have just described, let's go to the syllabus. So we just looked at describing the social, political, and economic practices of the indigenous peoples in the Americas up to 1492. Now we're going to explain the relationship between the main art forms and the beliefs and technology of the indigenous peoples. We're going to look at indigenous art forms such as architecture, music, painting, pottery, sculpture, and dance. All right, so if you get a question asking about indigenous art forms, these are what you should be talking about. So let's start by looking at indigenous art forms such as architecture. Now, indigenous architecture often reflected religious beliefs. For example, the Maya, they built pyramids and temples that were aligned with the celestial bodies used for rituals and sacrifices to the gods. The Tainos, they built huts which were organized around central plazas used for religious ceremonies, reflecting social order and reference for nature. So the music, in terms of music, music was an essential part of religious ceremonies, healing rituals, festivals, and warfare. Instruments like drums, flutes, rattles, conch shells were believed to carry voices to the spirit or gods. For example, the Tainos and the Kalinago, they use music in rituals to communicate with Zemis, their spiritual being, and to honor their ancestors. Painting. Paintings were symbolic, often used to record myth, rituals, and history. For example, the Mayan murals depicted gods, rulers, and cosmology, often found on temple walls. Body painting was used during ceremonies for spiritual protection or identity. Pottery was decorated with religious symbols, animals, and scenes from daily life. Some pots were burial items believed to aid the dead in their afterlife. Sculptures. The sculptures were mainly religious and symbolic, representing gods, spirits, animals, or ancestors. The Tainos, for example, they craft zemis from wood, stone, or bone for worship and guidance. Dance was sacred and ceremonial, performed to honor gods, celebrate harvest, prepare for war, or mark life events. So, in concluding, indigenous art forms were deeply intertwined with their belief systems and technological abilities. All right, now we're going to look at the indigenous beliefs and technology. Polytheism, animism, ancestral worship and sacrifice, scientific application, mathematics, agriculture, and astronomy. So if they ask you anything about indigenous art forms, these are the ones that you should focus on. If they ask about indigenous beliefs and technology, this is what you should be writing on. All right, so we're going to look at them. Now, polytheism, indigenous people like the Tainos, Kalinago, and the Maya were polytheistic. They believed in many gods. These gods controlled different parts of nature and life. Example, sun, rain, war, fertility. Types of gods and goddesses, nature gods. They had war gods. They had fertility and harvest gods. They also worshiped death and underworld gods. So nature gods were mostly sun god, moon goddess, rain god, corn god. War gods were especially important to the Kalinago, who were warriors. Fertility and harvest gods worship to ensure healthy crops and families. Death and underworld gods, particularly important to the Maya, who believed in life after death. Animism, they believe that natural things, as the word suggests, like animals, trees, rivers, and stones, had spirits. These spirits had to be respected and honored as they could help or harm humans. Animism shaped daily life. People prayed, made offerings, and offer permission and asked permission from nature before hunting or farming. So before they would go out farming, they would pray to their gods or offer them something. So to ask permission from nature before going to whatever job they were engaging. Ancestral worship and sacrifice. Ancestors were believed to have power over death and could influence the living. Offerings were made to honor the dead, and ask for guidance or protection. The Maya built temples and tombs for important ancestors. The Tainos, they kept zemis of ancestors. Sacrifice, a key part of religious life, especially among the Maya. So sacrifice was very important among the Mayans. Animals, food, sometimes humans were offered to please the gods or ensure balance in nature. Sacrifices were made during droughts, wars, or special festivals. Now we're going to look at scientific applications, mathematics, agriculture, astronomy. Now, what does that have to do with the indigenous people? Can you think about it? Oh, let's look at it. Now, the Maya, they developed a complex number system using dots and bars, and they invented zero long before the Europeans. Math was used in calendar making, astronomy, and building construction. Agriculture, indigenous peoples developed advanced farming techniques. They were the ones, the Tainos and the Kalinago, they were the ones who introduced slash and burn, the same slash and burn that our farmers are using today in farming. They introduced it. Terrace farming, which we are using now, and raised fields were introduced by the Maya. They grew crops like maize, cassava, beans, squash, and sweet potatoes. They understood seasonal cycles and soil management. Astronomy. The Maya were skilled astronomers, and there's a lot of our people today who still believe in astronomy. Let's get that out there. They tracked the sun, moon, planets, and stars. They created accurate calendars, solar, and ritual. Astronomy was linked to religion, used to plan festival, farming, and sacrifices. So indigenous peoples in the Americas, they had a deep spiritual beliefs that were centered on nature, gods, spirits, and ancestors. Their technology and science in math, agriculture, and astronomy were advanced and often linked to their religious practices. This system helped them organize society, grow food, understand time, and stay connected to the spiritual world. All right, guys, so I hope you are following. Now we are going to look at motivating factors that led to Columbus voyages, gold, God, glory. Now we're going to look at the first voyage, gold. Also means economic motives. Now, Europeans, particularly Spain, were seeking new trade routes to Asia for spices, silk, and other valuable goods. Columbus, he promised access to riches, including gold and other precious resources believed to be abundant in the lands he sought. The potential for economic gain through resource extraction and trade drove funding and support for his expeditions. God. The Catholic Church supported missionary work to convert non-Christian peoples to Christianity. Columbus and his backers hoped to spread Christianity to the peoples of the newly discovered lands. The voyages were partially framed as religious crusade. So these voyages, he would say that he's going on religious crusades aimed at expanding Christendom. Glory, political and personal prestige. European nations, they competed for power and dominance. Discovering and claiming new lands brought prestige and territorial advantage. Columbus himself sought fame and noble titles, as well as the legacy of being the first European to discover a westward route to Africa. So just a quick summary of the factors that led, or the motivating factors that led to Columbus' voyages: gold, God, and glory. As we said before, gold, it means economic motives. So Columbus, he was in search for a new trade route to Asia. European nations, especially Spain and Portugal, were eager to find an alternative route to the East Indies, which was rich in spices, silk, and gold. The overland routes to Asia were very long, dangerous, and controlled by Muslim powers, particularly the Ottoman Empire, which taxed goods heavily. Columbus, he believed he could sail west across the Atlantic and reach Asia faster. Another motivating factor that led to Columbus' voyages, God, meaning religious motives. So Columbus, he wanted to spread Christianity, and this was his major goal. The Spanish crown wanted to convert non-Christians, especially in newly discovered land. Columbus himself was a devoted Christian who saw his journey as a mission to spread the Christian faith and find Christian allies such as the mythical King John. Another factor that led to Columbus' voyages was glory, and glory means political motives. So Columbus promised to claim new lands for Spain, bringing honor and potential dominance over rival European powers, particularly Portugal. Discovery of new territories meant greater political and strategic control overseas. So he wanted to control the countries internationally, overseas. Development in navigation, cartography, and shipbuilding made long ocean voyages more feasible. The use of the compass and improved maps increased confidence in undertaking oceanic exploration. Columbus was personally ambitious. He sought titles, he wanted wealth and noble status. He convinced the Spanish monarchs to fund his voyage by promising riches and new territories. There was also growing curiosity about the world beyond Europe during the age of exploration. So, in concluding, Columbus' voyages were the result of intersecting motivations. He wanted economic greed, his religious zeal, national rivalry, technological progress, and personal ambition. These factors led to the famous 1492 journey, which opened the door to European exploration and colonization of the Americas. So you should be able to explain the factors that led to Columbus voyages. Now we're going to look at the impact of the Europeans on the indigenous people. So if you're asked to write about the impact of the Europeans on the indigenous peoples, these are some of the points that should be coming out in your answer. You should be talking about colonization, cultural imposition, demographic changes, economic destabilization, and all of that. Now, the first one we're going to look at is what impact did the Europeans add on the indigenous people in terms of demographic changes? Now, there was a drastic population decline. The indigenous population experienced a sharp decline, with estimates suggesting that millions of people died within the first century of contact with the Europeans. In some areas like Hispaniola, the Taínos population dropped from hundreds of thousands to fewer than a few thousand within decades. Now, what were the causes of these declines? Can you think about it? What caused a decline in the indigenous population? One, diseases. The Europeans, they brought smallpox, measles, and other illnesses. The indigenous people, they had no immunity, leading to widespread epidemics. Another cause of the decline was violence and warfare. Many were killed during conquest, uprising, and as punishment for resistance. Another cause of decline was enslavement and forced labor. Under systems like the encomienda, natives were forced to work in mines and plantations, leading to, they would have been exhausted, they would have been experiencing malnutrition and eventually death. Another cause of decline was disruption of societies. So food sources, destruction of food sources, forced relocation, breakdown of traditional social systems further contributed to demographic collapse. Now, another impact of the Europeans on the indigenous people were colonization, land seizure, and settlement. Europeans, they seized indigenous lands for settlements, plantations, and resource extraction. Indigenous peoples, they were displaced from ancestral territories, losing access to vital resources. Another impact of the Europeans on the indigenous people in terms of colonization was cultural disruption. So the European colonization, their aim was to replace the indigenous religions, languages, and customs with European ones, particularly Christianity. So the indigenous people, they were forced to be converted and their sacred sites were destroyed or repurposed. Another impact in terms of colonization that you could talk about was enslavement and labor system. The indigenous people, they were enslaved and exploited. They were forced to work on sugar plantations, in mines, or as domestic laborers. This exploitation contributed to poverty, suffering, and further depopulation. All right, so we're going to look at the impact of the Europeans on the indigenous people in terms of, cultural imposition and economic destabilization. The impact of the Europeans on the indigenous people in terms of cultural imposition and economic destabilization. Now, the arrival of the Europeans in the Caribbean and the Americas not only led to demographic changes or demographic collapse, not only did it lead to colonization, but also cultural imposition. Now, European colonizers, they imposed their religion, language, values, and customs on the indigenous peoples, often with the intent that they're going to civilize them or control them. Now, religion and spiritual practices were what they used as cultural imposition. So Christianity was forced on the indigenous people. They wanted to replace or suppress their indigenous spiritual beliefs. Now, indigenous religious symbols and idols, example, Zemis that was worshipped by the Taínos, were destroyed. Missionaries, particularly Spanish friars, established churches. The Spanish, they established missions and religious schools to convert the indigenous people. In terms of cultural imposition, indigenous languages were replaced with Spanish, French, Portuguese, or English. Oral traditions and native writing systems were suppressed or destroyed. Education promoted European worldviews, sidelining native knowledge and history. In terms of their dress costumes and social norms, indigenous clothing, rituals, and social structures were viewed as inferior or pagan. The Europeans, they introduced European dress codes, family structures, and gender roles, undermining traditional practices. They also introduced their way of dance, festivals, and oral storytelling were censored or reinterpreted under Christian norms. Now we're going to look at economic destabilization and how the impact of the Europeans on the indigenous people causes economic destabilization. Now, the traditional economics of the indigenous people, we know what they did. They were subsistent farmers, they did bartering, they did communal sharing. All of those were dismantled and replaced with systems that benefited European interests. The communal farming was interrupted as land was seized for plantations and mines. The indigenous crops were often replaced with cash crops like sugarcane. Natives were forced to grow what the colonizers needed. This led to food shortages and dependency on colonial systems for survival. In terms of the economy, under systems like the encomienda, natives were forced to work for the Spanish, often without pay. Economic values was extracted from indigenous communities through tribute systems and labor exploitation, leaving them impoverished. We can also look at the introduction of foreign economy. So the Europeans, they introduced a market-based economy, including the use of currency, private ownership, and taxation. So gone were the subsistence farming and the communal system that the indigenous people had. They now were introduced to market-based economy. They had to pay taxes, and they were now introduced to the use of a currency, money, and private ownership. The indigenous people, as we would assume, they were unfamiliar with these systems. They were economically marginalized and exploited. So, in conclusion, European colonization, they impose foreign religions, they impose their language, social structure on indigenous peoples while destroying their cultural heritage and destabilizing their traditional economies. These changes led to the erosion of the indigenous identity. It increased poverty and dependency and a long-lasting legacy of cultural and economic disruption. So if you're asked to write about the impact of the Europeans on the indigenous peoples, these are the points that you should be writing about. Now we're going to look at the impact. So how did the indigenous people impacted the Europeans? So we just looked at how the Europeans, how they impacted the indigenous people. We're going to switch it around now, and we're going to look at how the indigenous people impacted the Europeans. If you're going to write about this, you will have to talk about the introduction of crafts, agriculture products, provision of labor, and diseases. And we are going to look and explain each one of these. All right. Oh, let's go down. All right. So we are, all right, guys, let's go back to where we are. We are right here. The impact of the indigenous peoples on the Europeans. Now, the indigenous people of the Americas, they had a significant and lasting impact on European societies. So not only did the Europeans impacted them, but they also had a lasting impact on the European societies, particularly in the early period of contact and colonization. Their influence was seen in crafts, agriculture, labor, and even diseases, which reshaped European economies, diets, and colonial strategies. So we're going to look at how the indigenous people introduced their craft agricultural products to the Europeans. Now, indigenous people, they shared local local knowledge and craftsmanship that influenced European techniques and survival in the New World. Crafts and tools, the natives, they introduced Europeans to tools and materials such as canoes, hammocks, pottery, woven baskets, which were efficient and well suited to the environment. The indigenous people, they also helped to guide the Europeans navigate terrain, locate resources, and understand local weather patterns and seasonal cycles. How did they introduce their agricultural products? Now, one of the most important impact was the introduction of new crops and agricultural techniques to the Europeans. Now, the Europeans, they were introduced to maize, cassava, sweet potatoes, tomatoes, cocoa, tobacco, beans, squash, and peanuts, many of which became staples. So these food become staples or became staples in the European diet. They were introduced in indigenous people. They also introduced them to various plants that could be used for healing, some of which became valuable in European medicine. They also introduced them to their farming techniques. So the indigenous people, they taught the Europeans shifting cultivation, intercropping, and slash and burn methods, which helped the settlers adapt to tropical environment. How did they introduce the Europeans to provision of labor and diseases? So, provision of labor, though often forced, the indigenous peoples, they initially provided labor that was critical to early European survival and economic gain in the Americas. The natives, they were compelled to work on plantations, in gold and silver mines, and as domestic servants under system like the encomienda, right? Some indigenous people, they were skilled in construction, irrigation, and craftsmanship, and their knowledge was used to build European settlements. Transmission diseases transmitted to Europeans. So not only did the Europeans introduce disease to the indigenous people. So while the Europeans brought devastating diseases to the Americas, they also contracted some illnesses from the indigenous people. Many historians believed that syphilis was introduced to Europe from the Americas, spreading rapidly through European populations after Columbus' return. Now, the disease had a significant impact on European health and medical practices during the 16th century. So, in summary, the indigenous people of the Americas, they significantly influenced the European life through their agricultural innovations, provision of labor, and diseases. All right, so not only did the Europeans impacted the indigenous people, but the indigenous people, they also impacted the Europeans. So you should be able to explain how each group impacted each other. All right, guys. So we are going down to we're still at section A. We're going to theme 2. So theme 2, if you know how the paper is set up, it's in different themes. So you're going to answer questions based on Caribbean, economy, and slavery. Students should be able to explain the reasons for the change from tobacco to sugar and logwood to mahogany. All right, so we're going to look at that first. So we're going to look at economic revolutions in terms of sugar and mahogany. All right. Now, the Caribbean, as we know, experienced a significant economic transformation during the 17th and 18th centuries. Now, this shift was marked by a move from tobacco to sugar production, from logwood to mahogany extraction, leading to what is often called an economic revolution due to the scale, profitability, and global impact of these industries. So we're going to explain now the change that happened from tobacco to sugar production. Now, tobacco was one of the earliest cash crops grown by Europeans in the Caribbean. However, as the production increased in areas like Virginia and the southern colonies, there was overproduction, leading to a drop in prices. Overproduction, they had too many production of tobacco and not enough people to buy their products. They had to decrease the price. However, the European markets became flooded and profits from Caribbean tobacco declined. So because they declined the cost of tobacco in the European market, And the price was also, as I said, the price was declining in the European market. What happened is that the Caribbean, the tobacco that was selling in the Caribbean declined because people started to flood the European market for tobacco instead of the Caribbean because their price had declined due to overproduction. Now, sugar consumption rose rapidly in Europe in the 17th century, becoming a staple for sweetening food and drinks like tea and coffee. Sugar was highly profitable, far more than tobacco, making it the new white gold of the Caribbean. So sugarcane production was more profitable than tobacco. So sugar production was now the in thing in the Caribbean. Now the Caribbean had the ideal climate and soil for growing sugarcane. Planters switched to sugar for higher yields and export potential. Improvement in sugar milling and refining made large-scale production more efficient. Investment in sugar plantations led to industrial-like economies centered around sugar. All right, so that was the switch from tobacco to sugar production. Now, what change caused the switch from logwood to mahogany? Now, logwood was initially valuable because it produced dye for textiles, which was in demand in Europe. As synthetic dyes emerged and European colonies expanded, the value of logwood diminished. Now, mahogany became popular in Europe during the 18th century due to its durability, beauty, and rich color. It was used in luxury furniture, shipbuilding, making it a premium export product. The rise in the transatlantic trade and consumerism in Europe increased the demand for exotic hardwoods. So mahogany, fetching high profits abroad, make it more attractive than logwood. Now, we're going to look at the revolution from sugar and mahogany. Now, these changes led to a full-scale economic transformation in the Caribbean. Sugar production led to the creation of large plantations that required enormous amount of enslaved labor. This made the Caribbean the center of global plantation economy. Both sugar and mahogany industries required intensive manual labor. The demand for African labor skyrocketed, intensifying the transatlantic slave trade. Now, the Caribbean islands became export-oriented economies heavily dependent on European markets. Now, the profit helped to build European wealth. So, the profit that they got helped to build European wealth, cities, and empires, while Caribbean societies became economically and socially dependent on a few export crops. So, in conclusion, the shift that we're seeing from tobacco to sugar and from logwood to mahogany was driven by market forces, European consumer demand, and agricultural potential. These changes sparked an economic revolution that redefined the Caribbean societies, deepened colonial exploitation, and linked the region to a global economic system that was centered around profit, plantation labor, and resource extraction. So if you get a question on theme 2, asking about the reasons for the exchange from tobacco to sugar and logwood to mahogany, you should be able to explain that. Number two, assess the social, political, and economic consequences of the changes. So, as a result of the change from tobacco to sugar and from logwood to mahogany, what were some of the social, political, and economic consequences of those changes? And we are going to look at that now. So the transition from tobacco to sugar and from logwood to mahogany in the Caribbean during the 17th and 18th century had far-reaching consequences. These shifts were not merely agricultural or commercial, but they sparked major transformation in the region's society, politics, and economy. Now we are going to look at the social consequences that occur because of these changes, the change from tobacco to sugar and from logwood to mahogany. Now, the sugar and mahogany industries required extensive labor, and this led to the mass importation of enslaved Africans. Now, the Caribbean societies they become racially stratified, with white plantation owners at the top and enslaved Africans at the bottom. So the expansion of slavery was one of the social consequences of the change because um, they had to do a mass importation of enslaved Africans. Another social consequence of this change was the destruction of indigenous societies. So the growth of plantation economies further marginalized or eliminated the remaining indigenous populations through them seizing their land seizure, through the introduction of diseases from the Europeans, and also the indigenous people being forced to work. Another social change was class division. So a small wealthy plantocracy, which means the plantation owning elite emerged, controlling the economy and the government. The poor whites, free people of color, and enslaved Africans, they were forced to form the lower social tier with limited or no rights. All right, and there are other social consequences that you could look at. Now, what were some of the political consequences of the change? Increased colonial control. So, as profits grew, European powers tightened their control over Caribbean territories to protect their economic interests because in the Caribbean, this was where the money was. This was where the tobacco, the sugar, and the logwood and the mahogany was being grown. Now, colonial administrations they were strengthened to enforce plantation rules and suppress resistance. New laws, slave codes were enacted or introduced to control enslaved population and ensure their exploitation. Another political consequence was islands that were once marginal due to tobacco or logwood became politically valuable, prompting European rivalries and colonial wars over control. So because of the growth of these crops and the profitability that the Europeans were achieving from these crops, there become rivalries. So other other groups wanted to come in and control the means of productions in the Caribbean. Economic consequences, sugar and mahogany became highly profitable exports, linking the Caribbean to the triangular trade system. Caribbean colonies became central to the global economy, feeding European wealth. Another economic consequences, economy became monocultural, depending heavily on sugar or mahogany, making them vulnerable to price fluctuation and natural disasters. So lack of diversification hindered long-term economic stability because they were only depending on sugar production, and mahogany. Another economic consequence, profits led to the development of ports, roads, and towns, but primarily to serve plantation needs. There was little investment in public services or local industries for the broader population. Environmental consequences, deforestation from mahogany extraction and soil depletion from sugar monoculture cause lasting environmental harm. So, in conclusion, the shift from tobacco to sugar and from logwood to mahogany brought immense wealth to the Europeans and their colonial elites, but it became a severe social political but it came at severe social, political, and environmental costs. The Caribbean was transformed into a region of racially based plantation societies, colonial oppression, and economic dependency, laying the groundwork for the centuries of inequality and underdevelopment that persisted long after slavery was abolished. All right, so you should be able to explain 1 and 2. Going down nicely, guys, explain the reasons for the enslavement of Africans in the Caribbean. And we're going to look at some of our reasons: accessibility, affordability, demand, attempts to justify enslavement of Africans. All right, guys, please remember, if you have not yet liked this video, comment, subscribe, and watch the ads, guys. That's the only way you're going to be able to support my hard work in putting out videos to assist CXC students in getting a grade 1 in their respective subjects. All right. Now we're looking at the reasons for the enslavement of Africans in the Caribbean. Now, the enslavement of Africans in the Caribbean was driven by a combination of economic, practical, and ideological factors. Now, the first one we're going to look at is accessibility. Accessibility. Now, Africans, they had well-established internal systems of warfare, raiding, and trading, which European merchants exploited to acquire large number of captives. West African coastal kingdoms, like the Ashanti, participated in the transatlantic slave trade, exchanging enslaved persons for guns, cloth, and rum. The proximity of West Africa to the Caribbean compared to Asia or Europe made transportation feasible and profitable. All right. In terms of accessibility, African labor was accessible due to the existence of well-established slave trading networks along the West African coast. European traders partnered with African rulers and merchants who supplied captives through war, raids, and internal conflicts. These captives were sold in exchange for goods like guns, textiles, and alcohol. The geographic proximity of West Africa to the Caribbean also made the transportation of enslaved Africans efficient and profitable, ensuring a steady supply of labor for the growing plantation. All right. Another um Another reason for the enslavement of Africans in the Caribbean was affordability. Now, enslaved Africans, though expensive to purchase, were considered a cheaper long-term investment than indentured European laborers. Indentured servants work for only for a fixed period, 47 years, while enslaved Africans were bound for life, and their children inherited slave status. The cost per year of labor was lower for slaves than for indentured workers when spread over a lifetime. African labor was also seen as more reliable because enslaved people could not legally leave or demand payment. All right, so that was affordability. Another reason for the enslavement of Africans in the Caribbean was demand for labor. Now, the growth of sugar, coffee, cotton, cocoa, and mahogany industries in the Caribbean required a large, stable, and controlled labor force. So the indigenous population, they had declined drastically due to disease, warfare, and exploitation, and thus could not meet labor demands. The European laborers were often unwilling or they were unable to endure the harsh tropical climate and brutal working conditions. So what they did? They turned to African workers. Many from tropical climates, they were believed to be better suited for agricultural labor in the Caribbean. Another reason for the enslavement of Africans in the Caribbean was attempts to justify enslavement of Africans. So European societies, they developed various ideology and religious justification to rationalize their their reason for the enslavement of Africans. They believe one of their reasons were Africans were falsely viewed as racially inferior, uncivilized, and suited only for manual labor. Their religious argument was some Europeans claimed that Christianizing Africans through slavery was a form of salvation. So conversion was used to morally defend the immune practice, even though enslaved people were often denied basic religious rights. Another one of their reasons to justify enslavement of Africans was that laws such as the slave codes define Africans as properties. They were chattel, removing their rights and making them assets to be bought, sold, and exploited. Slavery was justified as a necessary institution for the economic success of the colonies and the mother countries. So, in conclusion, the enslavement of Africans in the Caribbean was not accidental but deliberate and systematic, built on the foundation of economic gain, racial ideology, and European imperial interests. Africans were targeted because they were accessible, economically beneficial, and easily dehumanized through carefully crafted justifications, all of which serve to uphold one of history's most brutal and exploitive systems. All right, guys? So if you're asked about reasons for the enslavement of Africans in the Caribbean, these are the reasons that you are going to talk about. Now, describe the transatlantic trade in Africans. So, we're going to look at the transatlantic trade. We're going to talk about organization, impact on West African societies, and experiences of its victims to describe the transatlantic trade. All right, guys, please remember to watch the ads on the video. As we know, the transatlantic trade in Africans, often called the Atlantic slave trade, was a brutal and large-scale system of human trafficking that lasted from the 15th to the 19th century. It was a central part of the triangular trade system linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Now, we're going to look at the organization of the trade. Now, European merchants, they traveled to the West African coast with manufactured goods such as guns, cloth, and rum. These goods were traded with African rulers and merchants for enslaved persons capturing through warfare, raids, or tribute. Now, the enslaved, they were held in coastal forts and barracoons before being loaded onto ships. The Middle Passage was the sea journey across the Atlantic to the Caribbean and the Americas, marked by horrific conditions, guys. Survivors were sold at auctions and distributed to work on plantations, mines, or estates. Ships were then returned to Europe with sugar, tobacco, cotton, and rum, completing the triangle. All right, so now we're going to look at the impact on West African societies. Now, millions of Africans were removed from their homelands, leading to depopulation in many areas. The trade encouraged warfare as rival states fought to capture people to sell to Europeans because they wanted the different things that they could get from selling the Africans. Traditionally, economics were weakened. Many societies became dependent on the slave trade for wealth and power. Families were torn apart, cultural and communal structures were damaged or destroyed. Powerful states like the Homini and Ashanti grew wealthy by participating in the trade, often at the expense of neighboring societies. And these are countries that are tribes that we're talking about in Africa. They contributed to selling their own Africans to work on plantation or in mines. Now we're going to look at experiences of its victims. As we can imagine, many were kidnapped during raids or sold by rival groups or even family members under pressure. They needed money, they needed to become wealthy. Captives were confined in cramped, unsanitary, often dungeons along the coast, often for weeks or months. The voyage lasted for 6 to 12 weeks in overcrowded, disease-ridden ships. Mortality rates were high due to diseases, malnutrition, abuse, and suicide. Survivors were stripped of identity, sold at auctions, branded, and forced into labor in unfamiliar lands with no legal rights. Enslaved Africans face harsh treatment, long hours of labor, family separation, and cultural eradication, but also develop forms of resistance, and they also develop, even though they were facing all of that, they managed to develop some form of resistance and cultural survival. So, in conclusion, the transatlantic trade in Africans was a systematic, organized, and brutal exploitation of human life for economic gain. It left a devastating impact on African societies, reshaping the Caribbean and American economies, and inflicted deep suffering on its millions of victims, whose legacy continues to influence the modern world. So if you're asked about the transatlantic trade, these are the things that you should be talking about. Organization of the trade, the impact on the West African society. How did the transatlantic trade impacted West African societies? And what was the experience of its victims? Alright, so we're going down nicely, guys. Don't want to make this video too long. Describe the ways in which African labor was used in areas other than sugar production. And to answer this question, we're going to again look at mahogany, logwood, cotton, coffee, and cocoa production. Alright, so we are describing the ways in which African labor was used in areas other than sugar production. So apart from sugar production, which other area did African labor was utilized? Now, while sugar was a dominant crop in the Caribbean, enslaved Africans were also used in various other economic activities that supported the plantation economy and export trade. So the question says, this describe the ways in which African labor was used in areas other than sugar production. So we know they were used on the sugar plantation, but we are not supposed to talk about that. We are going to look at other areas that they were utilized. And the other areas that we can talk about are mahogany, logwood, cotton, coffee, and cocoa production. So I'm going to look at a few of these because I don't want to make the video too long. So enslaved Africans, they work in forests, cutting and transporting mahogany and logwood for export. These hardwoods were in high demand in Europe for furniture and dye production. Labor was physically demanding and often required long trips into remote, mosquito-infested areas. Slaves were they faced hazardous conditions, including injury, tropical diseases, and attacks by wild animals because they were working to in the forest to cut mahogany and logwood. Another area apart from sugarcane in which they work was cotton production. So cotton was grown in some Caribbean territories like Barbados, the Bahamas, and parts of the Spanish colonies. Enslaved workers were responsible for planting, weeding, picking, and grinding the cotton. Cotton was exported for the booming textile industry in Britain. Another area that they had to work in was coffee production, grown especially in Jamaica, Haiti, and Cuba. Coffee plantations were labor intensive. Slaves, they cleared the land, planted, harvested, and dried the coffee beans. The mountainous terrain made this work particularly dangerous and exhausting. Another production that they had to work in was the cocoa production. Used to make chocolate, was cultivated in colonies like Trinidad and Venezuela. The slaves performed tasks such as pod harvesting, bean fermentation, drying, and packaging. Like sugar, cocoa was exported to Europe where it became a luxury good. All right, so you should be able to explain that. Now we're going to look at the physical layout and use of labor. So the objective is to describe the organization of a typical sugar plantation. To describe the organization of the sugar plantation, we're going to look at the physical layout and the use of labor in terms of male and female. Now, the sugar plantations were large, highly structured estates that functioned like industries complexes, requiring a one-year labor and precise organization. Now, the physical layout of the plantation, the sugar plantation, consisted of a field or the cane field that covered the largest area, divided into plots where sugarcane was planted, weeded, and harvested. There was also a factory, which was a boiling house or a sugar works located centrally. It included the mill, boiling room, and curing house where cane was processed into sugar. On the sugar plantation, there was also a slave quarters, rows of simple huts or barracks where enslaved people lived, usually far from the main house. There was also a great house, the plantation owner's residence, usually on higher ground with a view of the estate. There were other facilities such as a storage barn, stables, kitchens, and some sugar plantation had a hospital or a punishment area. All right, so that's the physical layout of the sugar plantation. Now we're going to look at the use of labor, male and female, on the sugar plantation. Now for the field work, most enslaved people worked in the fields. Labor was divided into gangs based on strength and skill. The first gang was the strongest males and females. They did the hardest tasks like planting and cutting cane. The second gang included older children and less strong adults. They performed lighter tasks. The third gang was children and elderly. They did the weeding or collecting trash. Now, in the factory, we had strong males often worked in the boiling house, which was hot and dangerous. Some enslaved men were carpenters, coopers, blacksmiths, or drivers. Women often worked as cooks, maids, nannies, or seamstresses in the great house. Women were also expected to reproduce and care for children to increase the enslaved population. So in conclusion, enslaved Africans, they played a vital role in many sectors of the Caribbean economy, not just sugar. Their forced labor powered industries like timber, cotton, coffee, and cocoa, while the plantation system imposed strict rules, long hours, and brutal conditions based on gender and strength. The plantation economy was designed to maximize profit at the cost of human dignity and freedom. All right, guys, so you should be able to describe the physical layout and the use of labor, male and female, on the sugar plantation. Now we are going to look at the syllabus asks us to look at describe the manufacturing processes on a typical sugar plantation before 1838. Describe the manufacturing processes on a typical sugar plantation before 1838. To answer this question, we are going to look at sugar production. We are going to look at the field, the factory, and shipping. We are going to look at rum production, fermentation, distillation, aging, and bottling. All right, so again, we are looking at describing the manufacturing processes on a typical sugar plantation before 1838. So the sugar plantation functioned as both a farm and a factory, producing raw material and rum for export. The processes involved several stages. So sugar production involved several stages. We had the field work to the factory, processing and shipping, with rum as a byproduct of sugar production. Now, the first one we're going to look at is field production. Sugarcane was planted in rows and took 12 to 18 months to mature. Enslaved laborers, they weeded and tended the crops regularly. Once mature, cane was cut by hand using machete and immediately taken to the mill as it began to spoil within hours of cutting. Now, the factory process included the cane was crushed using animal, wind, or water-powered mills to extract juice. Juice was collected in troughs and transferred to large boiling coopers. The juice was boiled multiple times in series of coopers to remove impurities and thicken it into molasses and sugar crystals. Workers had to skim and monitor each stage to avoid burning or contamination. Curing: the thickening syrup was poured into molds or hogsheads to allow molasses to drain out. This produced raw brown sugar, which was dried, packed, and stored. Now for the rum production, rum was made using the byproducts of sugar, molasses, and the scum from the boiling process. Fermentation: molasses and water were mixed with yeast and left to ferment in large vats or barrels for several days, producing an alcohol wash. Distillation: the wash was heated in copper skills, the alcohol evaporated, was captured, and cooled back into liquid. This process was often repeated for stronger rum. The aging and bottling process: rum was stored in wooden barrels for aging to enhance flavor and color. As I said, the longer you have the rum, the better it tastes. After aging, it was either bottled locally or shipped in barrels for bottling to be bottled abroad. Shipping and export. So for shipping and export, the finished product, sugar and rum, were packed into barrels, hogshead, and crates, then taken by ox cart or wagon to the port. Goods were shipped abroad, merchant vessels to Europe and North America, forming part of the triangular trade. Slaves were often traded for molasses or rum in Africa, which completed the cycle. All right, so you should be able to explain the manufacturing process on a typical sugar plantation before 1838. Now we're going to look at the markets for the production before 1850. And for that, we're going to look at the markets of sugar and rum, profitability and risk. Now, the largest consumer of Caribbean sugar, sugar was used in tea, baking, and confectionate. France, the Netherlands, Spain imported Caribbean sugar for refining and consumption. North America imported sugar for use in domestic markets and industries. For the rum market, North America, a major market, rum was consumed widely and also used in trade with Africa for slaves. Europe, less popular than wine or brandy, but still consumed. So Europe, they also imported some rum. Rum was targeted for enslaved persons and gold. So again, rum was used in Africa for exchange for slaves. Profitability and risk. For profitability, sugar and rum was highly profitable for plantation owners and colonial powers. Sugar became a luxury item, turned necessity in Europe, driving continuous demand. Rum had multiple uses, consumption, trade, making it a valuable byproduct. Risk, market fluctuations. Prices of sugar and rum could rise or crash based on European supply and demand. Hurricanes, droughts, or pests could destroy entire crops. Revolts and sabotage, example burning cane fields, pose constant threat. Naval conflicts or pirates could disrupt shipping and raise insurance and security costs. Finally, overdependence monocrop made colonies economically vulnerable if sugar prices fell. All right, guys, so you should be able to explain the markets for sugar and rum, its profitability and risk. Now we're going to look at describe African cultural forms in the Caribbean up to 1838. We're going to look at African cultural forms, including religion, language, dress, music, dance, food, and medicine. We are also going to describe the social relations in slave society, looking at class, gender, ethnic, and relations. All right, so let's go, guys. Alright guys, so we are looking at describing African cultural forms in the Caribbean up to 1838. Our answers should include African cultural forms such as religion, language, dress, music, dance, food, and medicine. Now, enslaved Africans, they brought a rich and diverse set of cultural practices to the Caribbean, which they preserved, adopted, and blended with European and indigenous influences. Now, despite the oppressive conditions of slavery, African culture survived and evolved in various forms, such as religion. So, African religious beliefs were based on ancestor worship, spiritual possession, and reverence for nature spirits. In the Caribbean, these traditions merged with Christianity to create religions including Voodoo, Obia, Santeria, which is in Cuba, Obia in the British Caribbean, and Voodoo, which is practiced in Haiti. Now, religious rituals often involve drumming, dancing, singing, and spirit possession. Language: Africans came from diverse linguistic backgrounds, including the Yoruba, Igbo, Akan, and Wolof. Other time, new Creole languages developed, mixing African languages with European tongues, such as we have the Jamaican Patos, we have the Asian Creole, we have the Trinidadian Creole, etc. These languages helped enslaved people communicate across ethnic lines and preserve cultural identity. In terms of dress, enslaved Africans often adopted traditional African clothing styles using the materials available to them. Women wore head wraps, skirts, and blouses, often in bright colors or patterns resembling African textile. Clothing was used to express identity, community ties, and resistance during ceremonies and festivals. Music Music was essential for spiritual, social, and political expression. Drum was one of the instruments that was instrumental in music in Africa. Music was part of work songs, religious rituals, storytelling, and celebrations. Dance African dance emphasized rhythm, body movement, and storytelling. It was closely tied to music and religion, used in rituals, ceremonies, and festivals. Dance also provided a space for cultural preservation and resistance to slavery. Food Africans introduced or popularized foods such as yam, okra, plantain, callaloo, rice, and pigeon peas. Cooking method includes stewing, roasting, frying, using herbs and spices. Medicine Africans rely on herbal medicine using local plants and natural remedies for healing. Knowledge was passed down orally and often involved spiritual rituals and folk beliefs. All right, guys, so those are the African cultural forms. Now we're going to look at describe the social relations in slave society. To describe the social relations, we're going to look at class, gender, and ethnic relations. Now, guys, please remember to watch the ads, to like the video, and to leave a comment. All right, guys, and to subscribe if you are new to this channel. So, slave society in the Caribbean before emancipation was rigid, deeply influenced by race, class, and gender, and maintained through violence, fear, and division. Now, the plantation system created a complex web of relationship among various groups. Now, class structure. Caribbean slave society was divided into several distinct classes. We have the white elite, which was the planters. These were plantation owners. They owned slaves and controlled wealth and power. They dominated the legal, political, and economic system. Another class was the middle class, the poor whites and the free people of color. The poor whites, often overseers, they were sometimes artisans or tradesmen. They had social privilege but limited wealth. Free people of color, these were mixed African and European descent. Some owned property and even slaves, but were socially restricted and discriminated against. The enslaved Africans had no legal rights and were treated as property, divided among skilled workers, domestic servants, and field laborers. Even amongst the slave, there was hierarchy. There were skilled laborers, drivers who had slightly better status, and there were field hands and they were the ones who endured the harshest conditions. Gender Gender roles in slave society were influenced by both African traditions and European expectations. Enslaved men typically assigned the heaviest field labor, such as clearing the land, harvesting cane, or operating the mills. Enslaved women work in the fields alongside men, often doing the same amount of labor. Women also work in plantation households, such as cook or maids. The women they frequently face sexual exploitation by white male owners and overseers. They played key roles in maintaining family, culture, and healing traditions. In terms of ethnic relations, white, so in terms of ethnic relations, the white, they dominated every aspect of life. They were seen as superior, and laws reinforced racial hierarchies. Free people of color, they occupied an uneasy middle position. They were discriminated against by whites, but sometimes they themselves distanced themselves from the enslaved. Another ethnic group was the African-born slaves. They were seen as more rebellious but retained stronger cultural ties. Another ethnic relation was Creole slaves. They were from the Caribbean. They were sometimes considered more adaptable or loyal, but still fully enslaved. Planters, they intentionally encouraged divisions among slaves based on ethnicity, birthplace, and status to prevent unity and rebellion. Alright guys, so we're going to stop right here for this video. In part 2, we're going to continue with theme 3, which is the resistance and revolt. Alright guys, please remember to like this video guys, leave a comment and subscribe if you have not done so. See you in part 2 of the Caribbean history syllabus.